This is Beyond Busy. I'm Graham Alcott. I'm the author of a number of books, including the global bestseller How to Be a Productivity Ninja, and I'm the founder of Think Productive. We help people to make space for what matters and get more done, and we partner with some of the world's leading companies who share our mission to transform the world of work. Beyond Busy is where I explore the often messy truths and contradictory relationships around topics like work-life balance, happiness and success, and explore with interesting people what makes them tick. In short, this is where we ask the bigger questions about work. My guest today is Debbie Millman. Debbie was described by Fast Company as one of the most creative people working in business, and she's the founder of the hugely influential Design Matters podcast. From 1995 to 2016, Debbie worked in leadership roles for Sterling Brands, leading influential projects for the likes of Burger King, Star Wars, 7-Up, and Campbell Soup. Her new book, Why Design Matters, taps into the brains of Tim Ferris, Brené Brown, Esther Perel, and Malcolm Gladwell, amongst many others, and explores what it means to be creative and innovative in work and in life. In this episode, we talk about her pioneering work, who owns your logos, how to deal with internet pylons, and much more. This is Debbie Millman. So I'm with Debbie Millman. How are you?
Hi, Graham. I'm good. It's really nice to be here with you.
Well, it's just really great to have you on the show. And so we're going to talk a bit about your book, Why Design Matters. And I thought maybe the best place to start would be to mention the fact that I am talking to one of the OGs of podcasting, right? Like you are like a legend in podcasting. So let's start with that because that's pretty central to the book too. So the podcast is Design Matters, and you started your podcast in 2005.
I did. In 2005, it actually started as an internet radio show. I was approached by a then fledgling internet radio network called Voice America, not Voice of America, which is very different, Voice America. And they were interested in my doing a podcast for their business network. And they originally wanted me to do it on branding. But I was most interested in doing it because it would give me an opportunity to do something that wasn't branding. And I had dedicated so much of my life at that point to branding and to my professional practice. And when I realized they weren't offering me a job, but rather offering me an opportunity to pay them to produce the podcast, I pretty much figured I could do whatever I wanted with it because that's really the lead gene for them was a profit center. So it started very much as a vanity project. And it really was because I was so bad at it that the fact that they let me put it up on the internet was just a miracle. But yes, February 4th, 2005, my first episode aired.
Over the years, obviously, like you say in the book that you then used the podcast as a really good excuse to go and talk to your heroes and interview really interesting people.
Yes.
And you talk about your sort of ethos of interviewing. Like, what do you think makes a good interview?
I think respect is one of the key elements. I think trust is also really, really important. A certain generosity and willingness to open yourself up. For me, it is a matter of really deep preparation to be able to allow the guest that I'm talking to talk about whatever they want, and for me to be able to converse with them about it because I'm not necessarily surprised by what they're saying, in that I have a sense of what they've done in that area and how they've constructed the practice that they have. So I think those are the three things.
And is there any, out of all the interviews that you've done, is there any that stands out as being like a particular highlight, perhaps like one that was really challenging or one that just turned into something really amazing?
Well, I've done nearly 500 episodes at this point. And so it's a little bit hard to say, oh, that was like the one. Certainly, my episode with Richard Saul Wurman, where he told me my questions were stupid and was very terse with me, was one of my most memorable. Although I have to say that it ended up being, I think, also one of my most listened to. And certainly my most commented upon.
Why did you think your questions were stupid? What was the issue?
Well, Richard is really I have to say he's kind of a genius. I mean, he's the man that created the TED conference. And I'm not entirely sure he was familiar with the format of the show, which is basically a deep dive into a person's origin story to understand how they've created and designed the life that they currently have. What obstacles did they go through? What challenges did they face? I'm not as interested in talking about somebody's successes as the process that someone took to get to that success. And Richard didn't want to talk about the past. He wanted to talk about the future. And I'm not a futurist. Right. I'm an analyst. So we were at a little bit of cross purposes because I was interested in understanding how he had gone from, in his own words, living in a flop house to becoming one of the most, sort of revered public intellectuals of our time. And so he was very impatient with me. He's like, why are we talking about the past? I don't understand. These are stupid questions. And I said, well, what do you want to talk about? And he goes, oh, that's a good question. Let's talk about the future. and so we were a bit at cross purposes. Ultimately, he wrote me after the episode aired and said that, literally, he said, at the time, he thought the interview was really terrible. But now, upon listening to it, he thought it was rather good. And so that was an interesting turn of events that I did not expect. And we're very friendly. And, that's who he is. And I'm who I am. And so we agreed to disagree about the process, but I think ultimately we're both pleased with the result.
Yeah. And then I think I just interrupted you as you were talking about another one there as well. What was the other one you were going to mention?
Oh, what was the other one I was going to mention? There's just so many interesting people that I've spoken to that it's so hard to say, that was my most memorable. Certainly, Richard was one of my most memorable just because it was so difficult and he was so terse and quite critical. But others that I think are important to my life, certainly my interview with my now wife, Roxane Gay, although we were already in a relationship when I interviewed her. But the reason for my reaching out to her in the first place was to invite her to be a guest on the podcast. So the fact that ultimately, first she said yes, then she ultimately said no. We didn't have a podcast. I kept bothering her about getting together and then actually asked her out on a date. And so then, after, 4, 5, 6 months together, we finally did have an interview. And that's actually when we sort of publicly came out as a couple. It was at the On Air Fest in Brooklyn, New York. And I interviewed her, and at the time, people didn't know, like even the people at the On Air Fest didn't know that we were dating. And so there was sort of an audible gasp when we talked about being in love during the episode. And so that's certainly one of my favorite for a lot of very, very poignant personal reasons.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be one that you go back and listen to a few times.
And obviously my interviews with Tim Ferris. Tim is one of my most extraordinary guests in so many ways. And we have I think a certain conversation chemistry, for lack of a better term. And he's really helped me quite a lot with the show. And we've had, I think, really important conversations, both on his podcast, probably more on his than mine, but certainly the conversations we've had on mine, I think, are really important too.
And when you think about podcasting now, so you were one of the early adopters of being a podcaster. Now it feels like everyone's got a podcast.
Yes.
What do you think are some of the things that you've seen change? What have you noticed has changed in that world of podcasting?
Well, certainly the awareness. I remember when I first started talking to people about it, they were like, oh okay. Is that something with your iPod? I mean, like, what? So people didn't know. And now when I tell people, they're like, oh, you too, you and everybody else and my grandmother. So, it's a little bit of a cliche now, but I'm not doing it for that reason. And I love doing it. And it's become, one of the greatest gifts of my life to be doing it. So the fact that everybody and their grandmother has one too just means I'm in good company, I guess.
I almost feel like you should go the other way, right? And so you have a period in your life where you're the only person with a podcast. And then now if you stop doing yours, you'd be the only person who didn't have a podcast. And that would feel like the cool thing to do.
Absolutely. I think there's some expectations that people have with podcasts that can sometimes be unrealistic. The fact that they just put out a podcast and expect people to listen to it isn't always the case. And I really recommend that people, when people ask me, what kind of podcast should I do? I suggest that they do something that they're really passionate about, that they're never going to get bored with, and that they're endlessly fascinated by. And I'm endlessly fascinated by how people construct their lives, how people manage their challenges and trauma, and that to me never gets tiring. I also expect that when people I tell people to expect that when they're doing a podcast, record 10 episodes, bank them, have them, and then put them out once every 2 weeks to establish some consistency, rather than have a great idea for a podcast, make the podcast, put it out there, put one episode out there, and then have to keep up with a schedule, because life gets in the way and priorities can sometimes change. And I think if you're going to plan to do something that's significant, do a batch of shows and then put them out, and do all of the necessary prep with your identity and your point of view and your positioning, and really approach it like you would any project for any client. And take it really seriously. Yeah.
Such good advice to have a bank of them. Is that how you generally operate with yours? So do you always are you like always 3 ahead or 10 ahead, or like how do you tend to do that?
Definitely not 10 ahead, but I do try to have about 4 or 5 ahead. And that's something that I find to be really helpful, especially if you're working with other people whose schedules are often busy. My producer is not just my producer, he produces a lot of other podcasts. And so I need to make sure that we have the time to do what we need to do in a way that allows for me to also be able to do all the preparation I like to do for my interviews, because I don't just sit down and say to somebody, which is often what people do now, like, tell me about yourself. And I'm like, I'm 60 years old. Right. You don't want me to talk about my life for 60 years. So I'll try to make it really snappy, but I'm probably going to leave a lot of stuff out.
Yeah, it's always that tension, isn't it? I'm always probably about 4 or 5 ahead, but if you're only 1 or 2 ahead and then someone cancels or dates go wrong, then you've got a gap. But also if you're 10, 15 ahead or something, then it just feels so not fresh by the time you put those episodes out. So you've always got to kind of, it's that like tension that you've got to ride down the middle.
Yeah, there's that continuum of feeling really new and interesting, and then really on the edge of when did I do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what did I talk about with them? It was so long ago. So Fast Company described you as one of the most creative people working in business.
Did you know that when that happened, I didn't even know that it happened? I didn't. I didn't know. I didn't hear from. I mean, and I love Fast Company. They're really great. It's a great magazine, a great site. I love working with the folks at Fast Company. But literally one day I was on the site looking for an older article that I had written from like 10 years prior. And so I did a search on the Fast Company site for my articles, and that popped up, and I'm like, hey, when did that happen? If I had known it had happened, I would have sent out like a press release. And I'm joking, I don't send out press releases, but I would have wanted to.
Well, I got that for, like, your publisher for the book, obviously picked up on that. But I wonder how many, if you went around the internet and kind of Googled, you could probably find loads more quotes like that, right? If they're all just like hidden away.
Well, then I'd also come upon the bad reviews, so I don't want to do that. But now it's like it's the first line of my bio. I'm like really milking that designation. Believe me.
But you do have this, really incredible career. So you ran Sterling Brands for a good period of time, and I love the thing that you say in the book where you talk about. At one point, you could have walked into the store and like 25% of the brands on the shelf are things that you've worked on, things that you've designed. So you've just got this real, like, what's quite interesting as I was reading that part of the book, it made me think that so often, and maybe it's partly because I'm in the UK and you're in the US, and like a lot of the brands that we have are US brands, it's Starbucks and Burger King and like all these big US brands. They all feel to me like quite far away and quite exotic. And then you're there actually working on them and actually shaping this kind of stuff. So you're at that, you've been at that coalface in terms of how branding works and stuff. So just wanted to start, exploring that a little bit. And I suppose the first question I've got is, when did you first get interested in the idea of brands and logos and like kind of telling a story through brands and logos?
There's sort of the professional interest that happened quite by accident. And then there's what I guess I could call the longing that started when I was a very little girl. And my dad was a pharmacist and he had his own pharmacy. And he was a sort of he had a mom and pop pharmacy. And when I was very little, my mother would take my brother and I to go visit him at the store. And I was enthralled by all of what I considered to be jewels in the pharmacy, the barrette and hair accessories spinner, where all of the goody ponytail holders were shining and very beautifully tinted. And I just looked at those things, and I don't know if it was because I just sort of grew up feeling kind of less than or with low self-esteem, but I looked at those things and thought, these are the things that can make me beautiful. These are the things that can make me feel pretty. And so the skin creams and the hair accessories, all of these things I coveted and literally collected and looked at longingly with such reverence, almost as if they were magical amulets. And then as I got older, those things, that love transferred to very typical things for a teenager, things like Levi's jeans and Lacoste polo shirts. I grew up in the 70s, so those were really, really important to me. And unfortunately, at the time, they were well out of my family's financial purview. My parents had gotten divorced. My mom didn't have a lot of money. She was a seamstress. She didn't understand why those clothing products were more expensive than dungarees, as we referred to them then, without the little tag in the pocket and without the little alligator on the breastplate. Like those things she didn't understand. She was like, well, we can go to the craft store and I can find you like little emblems that I can sew on your shirt myself. And I'm like, Mom, not only is that bad, but that's actually worse than not having it.
Yeah.
That's worse. She did not understand. But I do remember one point as a teenager riding my bike up to the craft store to see if I could find an alligator that I could indeed like iron on to my polo shirt. Alas, they were just things like Tony the Tiger and whatnot, which, wasn't the look I was going for. But I do have a photograph. By the time I think I got to be a senior in high school, saved up all my babysitting money and had one pair of Levi's and one Lacoste shirt. And I am posing by my friend's house and feeling very, very posh, very glamorous, that I had somehow arrived as one of the cool kids. When in fact I wasn't, I never was. But it made me feel in that moment like I was part of some elite group that I would not otherwise have had entry to. So I think that's really when it all began psychologically. And then as a professional, it was really quite by accident that I got headhunted into a branding consultancy from a design firm as a salesperson. And because I think of all of the power that brands had in my early life, I was very easily able to sell programs to clients for the agency that I was working at, first Interbrand and then Sterling. And that really became my path to leadership at Sterling through sales.
And so some of the things that you've worked on, Star Wars, 7-Up, Burger King, all of these huge names. Is there any that stand out to you as particularly significant in terms of you changing what that represented to people, or having an input in terms of making it represent something slightly different to what it did before?
I certainly think that the work that Sterling did on Tropicana is iconic. It's still the same package we designed 20 years ago. The straw and orange, and when that was taken away for a very brief period of time, people were just outraged, and so much so that that PepsiCo brought it back. That's certainly something that I feel really good about. The Star Wars work is not so much that I think it changed culture or moved the needle in any way, but now that my 14-year-old nephew is obsessed with Star Wars and superheroes and Marvel and collects the figurines, the fact that he has a package that I created more than 20 years
Yeah.
ago in his room as a collectible is also something that gives me enormous joy and enormous pride. And a lot of the work that we did has really stood the test of time. I mean, Burger King was just changed by Jones Knowles Ritchie and was magnificently led by Tosh Hall, but it lasted for quite a long time as logos go. It was over 2 decades, and we changed it at a time the brand was really suffering. It was the late 90s, and we needed to create a shinier, more modern look for Burger King. And so that's why the gradients were there. That's why the swoosh device was there. It was very of the moment and then lasted for well longer than that moment until very recently when it was just updated again. And ironically went back to a lot of the brand equity that it had prior. So it's sort of an interesting journey. But there's still lots and lots of logos and brands that still borrow from the brand equity that we developed and created. And I feel really proud of that body of work.
I'm just picturing you with particularly that Tropicana one when they go to change it and there's a big outcry and you're thinking, well, that's my baby. Everyone's defending my baby. That's a really special thing professionally, right?
It was, and we knew that it was changing. We had worked very, very hard to get that package that was in the market, the straw and the orange package, for quite a long time. And it was, I don't even know that it was necessarily on the market for as long as it took for us to make it and go through all the necessary market research and so forth. And then we heard that there was a new package coming. It was being managed by very senior people at PepsiCo, not the then design group at Pepsi. And so we knew that it was happening, but we didn't know what it was going to look like. And there was very little, if none, very little or no market research done at the time. So I was really jealous about that. I'm like, oh my God, they're bringing this to market without consumer verification. And I was like, how did the firm manage to convince Pepsi to not do market research? That's really what I was most envious of. And then when it came to market, I actually thought it was a really beautiful package. I think that Arnell did a nice job. I think the problem was there was no launch strategy to communicate to consumers why it was changing and what it was now going to be standing for and what it represented. And, you know, at the time, I remember talking to Paula Scher, who always tells the truth. You know, Paula is a truth teller. She says what she means what she says. And we had a long talk about it. And she said, I actually think it's really bad for graphic design and branding that this is happening. And it was not the response I was expecting. I thought she was going to give me high fives for having a package that people clamored to get back. And she said, I think it's just going to make it more difficult for corporations to feel that they can do really revolutionary work without big ramifications. And they're going to be much more tentative to stay very close in. And she was right. Now people say, oh, I don't want to do a Tropicana with the package. And she was, you know, as usual, she was right about that.
Yeah, it's those like really famous, you know, rebrands or, you know, the times where they've changed the formulation of what goes into Coke or Pepsi or something and there's a huge outcry. And then you realize that the corporation doesn't actually own the brand. Like it's kind of owned by everybody. Everybody has an investment in it, don't they? In terms of what they think the story is. And you talk about that in your TED Talk as well, which I took this line out of your TED Talk, which I just thought was really interesting. I'd love you to maybe just speak a little bit to it. But you said, branding is the profound manifestation of the human spirit. And I just really love that. I'd love you to just talk a bit more about that.
Very, very controversial line. Well, I think that if you look back at our time here as modern humans, we have been mark making for almost the entire time. We started first by communicating our reality and expressing our reality on the cave walls of Lascaux, and now we're finding even older caves that have even older mark making. It's a behavior that's really almost as old as we are. And from there, you can see a very distinct evolution of our mark making from first communicating on cave walls and then slowly over time moving to creating marks to signify our relationship to a higher power, which we refer to as religion and God. And the interesting thing is that many of these marks were created around the same time, but all over the planet. We weren't.
Yeah, and completely independently of each other.
And so a lot of our more ancient religions were created in the 10,000 year ago range. And they all, we all have marks. We all worship in an environment. We have rules and regulations about how to behave. From there, we went to developing flags, to developing family crests, and then to developing sort of the ultimate, I think, expression of a product, which is its label. Label. I mean, just think of that word, the label. Yeah. We label things. And the corporation really appropriated that behavior that was first created by humans for free. And then suddenly the corporation appropriated that behavior to be able to create recognition and consensus among people that were participating in the brand, either by buying it or experiencing it, using it, wearing it, etc. It's only in the last 10 years that we've begun to wrestle that power back in the creation of movements. And so people once again are creating marks by people, for people, now for the sheer purpose, the sort of single-minded purpose of changing behavior, changing the world. So Black Lives Matter, Me Too, they all use the tenets of branding in the same way that we corporate people have been using for the last couple of hundred years, but are now doing it not for a return on an investment financially or market share position or shelf presence, but really to change behavior. And so branding is a behavior that's really as old as we are. Whether or not it's used as a capitalist tool is a decision that we also make. And so on its best day, we can use the tenets of branding to change behavior that can change the world. And that is what I mean by that statement.
And that thing that you talk about, so you talk about Black Lives Matter and the Women's March you talked about as well, where it's like those things are bottom up rather than top down, right? So there's the corporate brands are generally top down, but a lot of the most exciting stuff that you're seeing is the stuff that's bottom up.
Yes. And, these are brands, but they're well more than brands too. They're movements. And you can have a branded product, but you also, in order for a movement to succeed, there needs to be a consensus around understanding what it means, why it's existing, what the purpose of it is, all of these things. Branding gets a bad rap because people think that it's just for capitalist reasons. It's just used to make money. But really what it's used for is to influence behavior or to express behavior and beliefs. Brands signify our affiliations. They telegraph our beliefs. And so whether or not we use them for making money or we use them for making change is our decision.
I wanted to come back to the sort of morality thing in a minute. I wanted to ask you about Milton Glaser's list in a second, but just before we do that, so I sort of tend to think that maybe one of the reasons branding gets a bad rap is that when I think of branding, it makes me feel a bit tired because there's so many brands competing for our attention. Is that something that you see as problematic? And do you think there's some kind of movement in terms of corporations looking at that and saying how do we because that's almost like damaging to corporations too, right? Like fighting for that space and it feeling like everyone's inundated when they leave the house just with thousands of logos. Do you think there's change happening in that kind of space?
No, I don't.
No?
No, I don't.
Just because the commercial pressure means it's too difficult to change.
There's innovation and then there is iteration. And innovation is about creating something new and iteration is about creating something based on something else. And innovation is really hard. And a lot of companies are buying brands because the path to the market is so fraught that rather than create something from nothing, they're buying other brands and then building on them. But we're also, the brand extensions exist for that purpose, to be able to continue to iterate because innovation is so hard. There are, I think, 112 variations of Oreos since they were originated. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah.
Depends on how much I like Oreos, I guess. All of these things are decisions we make. And if consumers don't buy, literally, figuratively, into the product, it's not made. Companies aren't making these things altruistically and thinking, you know what? We love this product so much. We are just going to wait for people to discover how amazing it is. We're going to keep on funding this. We're going to keep on paying the slotting fees. We're going to keep on bringing out advertising and working on the website and social media. And eventually people are going to realize how amazing it is. And then they're going to buy it. That doesn't ever happen. Ever, ever. Corporations only make what they think people are going to buy and what people end up buying. And if they don't, usually within 6 months or so, boop, off the market.
So let's talk about the morality thing of brands. One of the things I loved in the book, so the book has all of these like Q&A interviews and beautiful photography. And I guess if it's a book called Why Design Matters, it has to look beautiful, and it does. So Milton Glaser, who's a bit of a guru designer in his time, and I think he do the I Love New York symbol, yes. Was that his thing? And various other things. And he had this list of, here are the things that designers should never do, which I just thought was just a really nice way of sort of encapsulating, I guess, the morality that we all have, not just designers, but that we all have when we're sort of participating in capitalism and in work. Do you want to just talk about that list?
Well, I think, I don't think it was so much a list of what we shouldn't do. It was a list of things that we're sometimes asked to do, and how willing are we to do them. So I think it's either the 10 steps or the 12 steps to hell. I think it's 12 steps on the road to hell. And it starts out very innocuously, like, make the logo bigger, or make the wine look like it's got history behind it, things that we kind of all do, leading all the way up to working on something that causes someone harm.
So one of them was like use the metal from the World Trade Center to make a medal that commemorates 9/11 for a profit. And then it goes down into like doing the marketing for an SUV that is that they know has been tested that it will just, it will collapse and fall off the road and injure people and stuff like that. So it's kind of like this list of like, where do you stop on that list?
Where's the place for you? Yeah. Where's that defining line? And when it first came out, it was really quite provocative because, everybody has their different line. And then there are some people that are quite comfortable working on firearms, or quite comfortable working on cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol. Some people will say, well, if you won't work on tobacco, why are you working on alcohol? So, there's a lot of questions, necessary questions to ask oneself about choice making, decision making, and what you're willing and not willing to do.
How do you view that personally?
It depends on the time of my life. When I had my business and had 150 people to make sure got their paychecks every week, and was also a smoker, working on cigarettes at the time kind of felt exciting. I was working on, and this was in I want to say the 90s. This was in the 90s. I didn't feel particularly bad about it, but now I'm ashamed of it, really ashamed of it, and wish that I hadn't done it. But also at the time, again, I was a smoker, and I was working on products that I smoked. And I also was in a position where we needed the money. So was it a decision I regret? Yes. Would I have done it differently at that moment in time? Not sure. Would I do it now? Never. So people change, ideas change. Certain things I never was tempted to do. I would never have worked on firearms, but I was never offered an opportunity to, but I wouldn't have. I would never have worked for a pro-choice movement. I would never have worked for a candidate I didn't believe in. So there are certain things that are very black and white to me, and then other things that were a bit squishier.
Yeah, and I've had similar ones myself where there's definitely things that I'm proud of decisions I took at the time. And one of them in particular was about, do you guys have payday
Yes,
loans?
yes, we do.
Is
Horrible
that,
things.
yeah, so the idea is, so very high interest rates, and if you miss it by a day, and they're typically aimed at people who can't afford a regular bank loan or don't have the credit to get a regular bank loan. And I turned that down, and I also turned down a tobacco thing when we had no money in the business, and it was like, it would have been very easy to say yes to. But then there's also ones like, I mean, I drink, and I've had clients with my business that are alcohol companies that at the time it felt really cool to be going into these offices that have big long bars, and it's like, wow, like we can drink in the office. And then I guess as I've gone through life and had a couple of friends who've been very become very alcohol dependent and have had big crises in their lives through alcohol and stuff, it's like, did I do the right thing? And so I think it's really interesting what you say there, that some of that morality is in the gray area, and it's squishy, isn't it? And it's like it does change as you go through life, and it kind of feels like online culture doesn't really allow for that complexity.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I can look back on and say that I'm glad I did was give people the opt-out when we were working on the product. We never forced anybody to do it. So if there was anybody at the company that felt that it was wrong to do, we didn't expect anybody to do it if they didn't want to. And there were people that didn't want to. They still got paid. So, but still, I stopped smoking. My views on smoking changed, and ultimately don't want to participate in something that causes so much harm.
The other one I wanted to talk to you about from the book was the Tim Ferris thing about fear. So just tell me a bit more about that. So he's been on your podcast, you've been on his podcast, and it feels like you do have this very open dialogue when the two of you are talking, and we'll put the links to those episodes in our show notes so people can go and check it out. But like, how would you describe your relationship with Tim and the conversations that you have?
Well, Tim described our relationship in the introduction he wrote in the book as I'm his sister from another mister. So I guess I would say the same thing. He's my brother from another mother. We feel like siblings. We do feel very connected, sort of deep in our souls, with lots of similar experiences that we've gone through, as well as lots of similar ambitions and ways in which we've coped, and also very different ways. But for whatever reason, we've always sort of nudged into each other's hearts when we've had our interviews. And it started that way. He came on my podcast first, then I went on his, then he came back on mine again, and then I went on his again. And every time we discover something new about ourselves in those conversations, not just finding connection in each other, but also learning and growing. The first time I was on his show, when he asked me about my work with the Joyful Heart Foundation and why I said publicly on this site that work made my life make sense, no one had ever asked me that before. I hadn't been public with a lot of my early childhood trauma, and suddenly there I'm talking to the most popular podcaster in the world, being asked about something so personal that I had to sort of fall into that moment with open arms and an open heart, and really talk about things that I'd never talked about publicly before. And it was, again, one of the great gifts of my life, being able to suddenly have that freedom to share in a way that felt safe and important and necessary.
And that was a great conversation. And it one of the things I could say, listen to it, is it sounded like you'd talked about it hundreds of times before, like just the eloquence that you had with that conversation, which I guess is one of the real sort of gifts of, like your chemistry with him and like that interview, but also podcasting as a whole. It like has this very sort of it's an intimate medium in many ways, isn't it? Even though it's going to go out publicly, at the time it's just the two of you, going back and forth and connecting in that way.
Right. And especially when we're in my studio, because it's very dark, and back pre-COVID, I was doing all my interviews live. And so we're sitting 3 feet apart, sort of staring into each other's eyes and just having this very intimate experience, not sexual in any way, but just a very intimate, close, almost symbiotic relationship in that moment.
Yeah, it's amazing. I wanted to talk to you about. So one of the things he talked to you about in that interview is that you were you were one of the first victims of an internet pylon.
Back in
Fair to say.
2003, yes.
So the background to this is it's the website called Stand Up or Speak Up.
It was. Now, I mean, Armin Witt founded it in, I think, 2002, and it ran for, I think, about 10 years. And now he has another site that's even more popular called Brand New.
And so this was because you were you were a judge for a big design award, and some people on. So this was one of the really early internet forums. They kind of took exception for the fact that you were the big kind of corporate person that had done all this, famous corporate work, and that you were in this sort of position as the judge, and they kind of took umbrage to that, and it became a very personal thing. Do you want to tell the story from there?
Well, I had been the backstory is so interesting, at least to me. I had been part of AIGA's brand experience group prior to being asked to be a judge. And that was, I think, in like 98, 99, 2000, around then. And I loved doing it. And I was on the board of this little brand experience group within AIGA, which is AIGA stood for the American Institute of Graphic Arts. And now it's AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. And I loved being part of this little group. And when my term was over, I reapplied, as did everybody else on the board at the time. And I was the only one that didn't get asked to re-up my boardmanship. And I felt very rejected and very kicked to the curb. And the then executive director of AIGA, I think as a consolation prize and to try to keep me encouraged about being involved with the organization, he asked if I would be a judge in this upcoming annual competition, which was very prestigious. And I hadn't ever been asked to do something like that before. And I was so thrilled and so excited. When I did the judging, I was judging with two very well-known designers that felt that any package design could never, ever, ever win an award in the competition, that it was just too mass market, too ugly. We were judging the packaging design competition. And so it's kind of hard to eliminate like everything that's a mass market packaged good. And there were some nice ones, but it was a very cantankerous experience. I think we all agreed at the end of the day on only 7 things that would make it into the annual, which is not what AIGA wanted. They wanted way more. And so I left that day at AIGA headquarters thinking, oh, I'm, never, ever going to be part of AIGA again. And then I don't know if it was a year later or a month later, it's really hard for me to remember the specific timing of when I judged. And I think maybe it was about a year or so later when the annual came out. The people on Speak Up, the sort of renegade rogue writers, the anti-establishment designers that were very critical of AIGA saw the association that they had with me, who they thought was a corporate clown, and really they wrote an open letter to AIGA about their association with me and how they could be involved with somebody like me that they refer to as a she-devil. Now, I can laugh about it 20 years later, but at the time I was mortified and horrified and was really worried that I was going to get fired from my job when people saw that I was being that I was the head of Sterling's design division and now being called this corporate clown and the she-devil. And it took me a while to figure out what to do. I didn't want anybody at my office to know. People weren't reading blogs back then very much. This was a very small group of people, but it did feel like it went viral online. And then I ended up writing in, and they were still very, very critical, and ultimately just sort of put my tail between my legs and walked away. I was still really, really, really hurt about it. They wrote another article about me asking if the dark side was prevailing, as if I was Darth Vader, And then a couple of weeks after that, Armin wrote to me and apologized for the bullying. And it was interesting. He didn't want to take back the fact that he thought my work was what he referred to online as a pair of turds. And he was talking about Burger King and Star Wars. but he felt bad that I had been treated the way that I had. And I wrote him back and I said, I accept your apology. Thank you. But, you have this really interesting forum here. People are holding people accountable in real time, having these really robust conversations about design. This could be better. This could be really significant. And he wrote me back and said, well, would you like to write for the site? And I was like, sure. And I did. And that moment, while the bullying and the sort of being, I guess, attacked like that was so painful and so hurtful at the time, it became the entry point for every single thing that then happened thereafter in terms of my writing for Speak Up, which turned into my opportunity with Voice America, which turned into an opportunity with Print Magazine, which turned into my meeting Milton Glaser, which turned into like every single thing I'm doing now. And so the worst moment of my professional life really turned into the most significant. And I think that's important for people to hear, because you don't always know how the story is going to end when you're in the middle of it. And while I, at the time, would have wished anything else could have happened, anything else, the fact that it happened now, I wouldn't have changed even a moment of it, because it turned into every aspect of my life today.
Feels like there's a really important lesson in all of that around fear and kind of, looking at some of those situations where you can have these fears that, my career is about to end and all these things are going wrong. But
yeah, I thought I was going to get fired from my job, that I was going to be just completely banished. And at the time, it felt like I was the most hated person in American graphic design. The AIGA people, the establishment hated me. I had been kicked to the curb. The Speak Uppers didn't know that. They just saw that this association existed. They didn't know that I was really very unceremoniously just discarded. And then now the anti-establishment hated me too. So I just felt like the most hated person in American graphic design.
But it's like that thing, isn't it, where if you can look beyond that kind of lizard brain sort of fear-based thinking and actually just say, what I'm doing is I'm making connections and putting one step in front of the other, and actually, I'm making some progress on some stuff here. Even if not everybody loves it, the people who are drawn to your work will find you, and like, it's amazing how much we just don't do because we put up that barrier of the fear of judgment, right? And the fear of being taken down.
Absolutely. And then it ended up being, then Emily Oberman, who was then the president of the New York chapter of AIGA, invited me to be on the board of New York chapter, which I did for several years. Then Sean Adams invited me to be on the national board. And then I ended up being the president of the national board, which was president of the entire organization. And then ended up in 2019, so 16 years later, winning the AIGA Lifetime Achievement Award. So it's surreal. It's surreal. And let me tell you, the most magnificent thing about this is that I am the godmother to Armin's oldest child. Okay? So that's how close Armin and I are now. It's amazing. Bryony is the reason. Bryony is Armin's wife, the co-founder of Speak Up. She's the reason I ultimately first uploaded my digital files from Voice America to iTunes, because she didn't want to listen to it live. It was too hard for her with, little kids and life. And she's like, put it up on iTunes so I can just listen to it whenever I want. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And so that's why it became a podcast.
That's such a lovely sort of bringing us back to where we started the conversation around the podcast as well. I wanted to just ask you one other thing before I let you go, which is, I was just explaining to you before we hit record that I'm working on this book about kindness, and your eyes lit up. So I would just love to just talk to you about kindness, and what does kindness mean to you in terms of work and leadership?
I think it means a generosity of spirit. And it's very, very, very important to me to be kind and as generous as I possibly can be. I don't know if it's because I wasn't treated with kindness when I was growing up, but I find kindness to be next to love in terms of importance. And I'll go back to something Milton Glaser said to me in 2005 when I took a class with him at the School of Visual Arts, long before I was teaching there. And he said that you can see the world in one of two ways. You can see the world as a world of scarcity, where you have to hold on to everything you have because there's so little of it. Or you can see the world as one of abundance, where there's enough for everybody if we share. And that has been my sort of creed since then. There's enough for everybody. Share what you can, and then give away what you don't need. And that's something that I find to be really important.
And do you, like you were saying earlier about the not having the Levi's, and sounds like we had very similar childhoods in that way too, and like the parents, knitting the alternatives and whatever. Has that changed for you over time? And was there a moment where you flipped from scarcity into abundance, or just kind of saw that in a different way?
When I graduated college, the lead gene for me was self-sufficiency. I needed to be able to support myself because I didn't want to go back to either my mother's house or my father's house. And I wanted very much to be self-sufficient. What you find over time is when you think you've reached the financial goal, what's your number, and you get it, you realize, oh no, I need more. Because we metabolize everything very quickly. And if we're using these external markers to signify safety and security, and we don't feel that internally, there's nothing that's ever going to be able to fill you up. And so that's something that I've learned in terms of what you think you need to be safe and what you think you need to be secure. As far as brands and using brands to give me social cachet, sure, there are times when I feel like, oh, that pair of shoes or that whatever will make me feel prettier, but it doesn't last. And I know that, as Dan Pink would say, if your idea of success is the biggest possible flat screen TV in existence, you're playing a fool's game, because you'll metabolize that TV really quickly and then want another one. For everybody that was satisfied with the promotion to vice president, how long did it take before they started thinking about when they could be senior vice president or president? And I've been through all of that. So I know that before we achieve or receive or acquire these things, it might feel like that's enough. But when we do, if it's not based on a strong inner foundation, it's never going to be enough. So I look at those experiences now, and when I'm tempted to whatever it is I want or think I need in order to be this or that, I know that it's fleeting.
Absolutely, which is about the most perfect, beyond busy encapsulation that we can reach. So just before we finish, where can people follow you online? The book is Why Design Matters, and obviously we encourage everyone to get out there and buy it in printed form, because it's just more beautiful that way. It's just a really beautifully designed book. But where do you hang out online? Where can people connect with you and find out more about what you're up to?
Well, Instagram, Twitter, at Debbie Millman. I have a Design Matters Facebook page, which I post on, and then DebbieMillman.com. And from there, you can get to the podcast and also now the book.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being with us.
Graham, thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
This video is sponsored by Think Productive, home of the Productivity Ninja. We help people and organizations to increase their impact and make space for what matters through a range of workshops, programs, and coaching. Head to thinkproductive.com to find out more. Are you interested in booking me as a speaker for your event? You want to sign up for my Rev Up for the Week email? Do you want to buy some of my books? Or do you just want to find out what I'm doing right now? It's all at grahamallcott.com/links. And if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share so we can make more. Thanks for watching.